The small brass key felt cold against my fingertips as I pulled it from Nathan's jacket pocket, searching for tissues to dab the tears from my eyes. It was nothing like any key I'd seen before, ornate and weathered, with intricate engravings that caught the morning light streaming through our bedroom window. Nathan lay motionless in the hospital bed beside me, machines beeping their mechanical rhythm, keeping time with what remained of his life after the accident. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I'd been married to this man for 12 years, shared a bed, a home, dreams of children that never came, countless conversations about everything and nothing. Yet this key in my palm felt like holding a piece of a strange. The metal was warm now from my touch, and something about its weight suggested it opened something significant, something important enough that Nathan had carried it with him always, hidden in the inner pocket of whatever jacket he wore. The doctor said he might not wake up. The semi-truck had come out of nowhere on Highway 26, they explained, T-boning Nathan's sedan as he drove home from what he'd told me was a late meeting with clients. But Nathan was an insurance adjuster who worked standard business hours. What meeting ran until 10 o'clock on a Tuesday night? What client required face-to-face discussions in the mountains outside Portland? The questions multiplied as I sat in that sterile room, watching Nathan's chest rise and fall with artificial assistance. The key seemed to pulse in my closed fist, demanding attention I wasn't ready to give. For 3 days I'd maintained my vigil, leaving only to shower and change clothes at our suburban ranch house that suddenly felt cavernous and hollow without Nathan's presence filling it. Our marriage hadn't been perfect, but it had been comfortable, predictable in ways that I'd convinced myself equated to stability. Nathan left for work at 7:30 each morning, returned by 6 most evenings, and we'd settle into our routine of dinner, television, and the quiet companionship of two people who'd grown alongside each other for over a decade. He handled our finances, managed our insurance policies, made decisions about home repairs and vacation destinations, while I focused on my part-time job at the local library and the endless small tasks that kept our household running smoothly. Looking back now, I realize how little I actually knew about Nathan's daily life beyond the broad strokes he shared. He was good at deflecting deeper questions with humor or by redirecting conversations toward my own experience. When I'd ask about particularly challenging cases or difficult clients, he'd wave a hand dismissively and say work was boring, that he'd rather hear about the patrons I'd helped that day or the new book displays I'd arranged. The hospital chaplain visited on the third afternoon, a kind woman with silver hair who spoke gently about hope and healing while her eyes conveyed what the doctors hadn't quite said directly. Nathan's brain activity was minimal, she explained, and the longer he remained unconscious, the less likely he was to recover fully. She offered to pray with me, and though I wasn't particularly religious, her presence brought a comfort I hadn't expected. After she left, I found myself alone with the key again, turning it over in my hands as I tried to make sense of its significance. The engravings were clearly deliberate, forming a pattern that suggested craftsmanship rather than mass production. One side bore what looked like intertwined tree branches, while the other showed symbols I couldn't identify, possibly letters in a language I didn't recognize. The key's head was larger than typical house keys, more substantial, as if it opened something meant to life. That evening, unable to bear another night of watching machines breathe for my husband, I drove home to gather clothes for an extended hospital stay. The house felt different somehow, as if Nathan's absence had shifted the very air inside it. I moved through rooms we'd shared for 8 years, seeing them with new eyes, searching for clues I'd never thought to notice before. In Nathan's home office, I studied the desk where he'd spent countless evenings supposedly catching up on paperwork or researching policy claims. The surface was meticulously organized, just as he kept everything in his life, but now that precision felt almost performative, like a carefully constructed facade designed to prevent closer inspection. His computer was password protected, which had never bothered me before since I had no reason to use it. Now that barrier felt significant, another locked door in a house that was revealing itself to be full of them. I searched through his desk drawers, finding the usual collection of office supplies, old bills and insurance documents related to our own policies. Everything was exactly what I'd expect to find, which somehow made it feel suspicious. Where were the personal touches, the accumulated debris of a life lived? Nathan's workspace was as impersonal as a hotel room, scrubbed clean of anything that might reveal the man who used it daily. The bedroom offered similar mystery. Nathan's clothes hung in perfect order, organized by color and season, but I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd seen him in anything casual or rumpled. Even on weekends, he dressed as if he might need to meet clients at any moment. His nightstand held only the most basic necessities: reading glasses and a generic thriller novel that looked unread, its spine uncreased. Standing in our walk-in closet, surrounded by the careful arrangement of our separate lives hanging side by side, I felt a wave of loneliness so profound it took my breath away. When had we become strangers sharing a space? When had I stopped asking questions and settled for surface-level conversations about weather and weekend plans? The key in my pocket seemed to grow heavier as these realizations accumulated. Nathan had been carrying a secret significant enough to require a special key, yet I'd been so absorbed in the comfortable routine of our marriage that I'd never noticed the gaps in his stories, or the careful way he compartmentalized his time. The man lying unconscious in the hospital was my husband, but he was also someone I was beginning to realize I'd never truly known. Sleep eluded me that night, my mind cycling through 12 years of memories, searching for signs I'd missed. I remembered business trips that seemed longer than necessary, weekend errands that took entire afternoons, phone calls he'd take in another room. At the time, these things had seemed normal, respectful even. Nathan was giving me space while handling the boring details of his work life. Now I wondered if he'd been protecting something else entirely. The next morning brought a call from Dr. Martinez, Nathan's neurologist, asking me to come in for a consultation. Her tone was gentle but serious, the kind of voice medical professionals use when they need to deliver difficult news. I dressed mechanically, grabbing the first clothes I found, the mysterious key a constant weight in my jacket pocket. The hospital's neurology wing buzzed with quiet efficiency, nurses and doctors moving with purposeful grace through halls that had become familiar over the past 4 days. Dr. Martinez met me in a small conference room, with windows overlooking the parking lot where Nathan's wrecked sedan had been towed after the accident. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was discussing my husband's future while looking down at the destroyed vehicle that had been carrying him to or from a destination I couldn't identify. Nathan's condition had stabilized, Dr. Martinez explained, but the lack of meaningful brain activity suggested the injuries were more severe than they'd initially hoped. The decision about continuing life support wasn't urgent, but it was something I'd need to consider in the coming week. She spoke about quality of life, about the difference between existing and living, about the importance of honoring what Nathan would have wanted in this situation. The problem was, I realized with growing horror, I didn't know what Nathan would have wanted. We'd never discussed end-of-life preferences, never talked about our fears or hopes for how we'd want to be remembered. Our conversations had stayed safely in the present tense, focused on immediate concerns and surface-level planning. The deeper questions, the ones that revealed character and values and dreams, had somehow never emerged in 12 years of marriage. Walking back to Nathan's room after the consultation, I passed the hospital gift shop and noticed a display of handcrafted items made by local artisans. The sign indicated these were created by members of various craft collectives throughout the Pacific Northwest, sold to benefit the hospital's patient assistance program. Something about the careful workmanship of the wooden bowls and hand-woven scarves reminded me of the key's intricate engravings, the attention to detail that suggested a maker who cared deeply about their craft. I found myself studying each piece, running my fingers over smooth wood grain and soft textile patterns, wondering about the hands that had shaped these objects. There was something personal and intimate about handmade items that mass-produced goods could never capture, a connection between creator and object that imbued each piece with meaning beyond its function. The key in my pocket felt similar, crafted with intention and care, meant to open something specific and significant. That afternoon, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of returning to the hospital room to continue my vigil, I drove home and began searching in earnest for any clue about where the mysterious key belonged. If Nathan couldn't tell me about the secret he'd been carrying, I'd have to discover it myself. The key was my only lead, and something deep in my gut told me that finding what it opened would answer questions I was only beginning to know how to ask. Starting with Nathan's car registration and insurance papers, I traced his recent travels through credit card statements and gas receipts. The pattern that emerged was puzzling but consistent. Once or twice a month, Nathan made trips northeast of Portland, always on weekends when he'd told me he was running errands or meeting old college friends. The destinations varied slightly, but they clustered around small towns in the Cascade Mountains, places like Government Camp, Rhododendron, and Timber Ridge. Timber Ridge appeared most frequently in the records, a tiny community I'd never heard of despite living in Oregon for most of my adult life. Online searches revealed it was an unincorporated area known primarily for its dense forests and a small population of year-round residents who valued privacy and self-sufficiency. There were a few businesses listed, mostly related to outdoor recreation and artisan crafts, but nothing that obviously connected to Nathan's work as an insurance adjuster. The most recent gas receipt was dated the day before Nathan's accident, from a station in Zigzag, just 20 minutes from Timber Ridge. He'd filled his tank there at 4:30 in the afternoon, then purchased coffee and what appeared to be a sandwich. The timing suggested he'd planned to spend several hours in the area, not just passing through on his way to somewhere else. Armed with this information and the mysterious key, I made a decision that terrified and exhilarated me in equal measure. The following Saturday morning, I would drive to Timber Ridge and see what I could discover about the secret life my husband had been living. The key would guide me, I reasoned, leading me to whatever door it was meant to open. If Nathan survived his injuries, perhaps I'd finally understand the man I'd married. If he didn't, at least I'd know who I was grieving for. The drive to Timber Ridge took me through increasingly dense forest, winding mountain roads that climbed steadily away from the familiar suburbs of Portland. Cell phone service grew spotty, then disappeared entirely, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the rhythmic hum of tires on asphalt. The landscape outside my windows transformed from managed suburban forests to old-growth wilderness, where massive Douglas fir and cedar trees created a canopy so thick that midday felt like twilight. I'd printed directions from an online map service, but they proved nearly useless once I left the main highway. Timber Ridge wasn't marked by any official signs, just a cluster of mailboxes at a dirt road intersection, and a hand-painted wooden marker that read, TR Community Center 2. The road was barely wide enough for 2 cars to pass, rutted and rocky in places that suggested it wasn't regularly maintained by county services. The community center turned out to be a modest log building surrounded by pickup trucks and a few cars with mud-splattered exterior. Smoke rose from the chimney, and warm light spilled from windows that suggested people gathered here regularly, despite the remote location. I sat in my sedan for several minutes, feeling suddenly foolish and unprepared. What was I planning to do? Walk up to strangers and ask if they knew my husband, show them the key and hope someone recognized it? Before I could lose my nerve entirely, an elderly woman emerged from the building and approached my car with a friendly smile. She was probably in her 70s, with silver hair braided down her back and clothes that looked handmade but practical. Her face was deeply lined from sun and weather, but her eyes sparkled with curiosity and warmth. "You look a little lost, honey," she said, leaning down to speak through my partially open window. "I'm Dorothy Kim. Are you looking for someone in particular, or just exploring the area?" The directness of her question caught me off guard, and I found myself fumbling for words. "I'm Clara Rodriguez," I managed finally. "I'm looking for..." "Well, I'm not exactly sure what I'm looking for. My husband had this key, and I think it might open something around here." Dorothy's expression shifted subtly, her friendly smile becoming more focused and interested. "A key, you say? That's intriguing. Would you mind showing it to me? I've lived in these mountains for 40 years, and I know just about every lock within 50 miles. I hesitated for a moment, then pulled the brass key from my pocket and held it out toward her. Dorothy's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. Her eyes widened with recognition, and she drew in a sharp breath that suggested the key meant something significant to her. "Oh my," she said softly, reaching out to touch the key with gentle fingers. "I haven't seen this in quite some time. Your husband, what's his name?" "Nathan Hayes," I replied, watching her face carefully for any sign of recognition. Dorothy nodded slowly, her expression growing sad and understanding. Nathan, yes, I know Nathan, though he's always been very private about his home life. We wondered why he hadn't been around lately. Is everything all right? The concern in her voice was genuine, and I felt tears welling up unexpectedly. Here was a stranger who knew my husband well enough to notice his absence, who cared about his well-being in a way that suggested real friendship. Yet I'd never heard Nathan mention Dorothy or anyone else from Timber Ridge. He was in an accident, I explained, my voice catching slightly. He's been unconscious for almost a week now. I found this key in his jacket pocket, and I don't know what it opens or why he had. I've been married to him for 12 years, but I'm realizing there's so much about his life that I don't understand. Dorothy's face softened with compassion, and she placed a warm hand on my arm through the car window. Oh honey, I'm so sorry. Nathan is a good man, one of the finest craftsmen I've ever known. That key opens his workshop, his sanctuary. He's been part of our community here for about 5 years now, creating the most beautiful furniture and wood sculptures you've ever seen. The words hit me like a physical blow. Nathan, a craftsman, my husband who claimed to have no artistic interests, who insisted he was all thumbs when it came to home improvement projects, the man who hired professionals for every repair and dismissed my suggestions about taking pottery classes or learning to garden together. I think Dorothy continued gently, you'd better come inside and let me make you some tea. There's a lot you need to know about your husband's life here, and it's not a conversation for a parking lot. I followed Dorothy into the community center, my legs unsteady as I tried to process this revelation. The interior was warm and welcoming, with exposed beams and stone fireplaces that suggested the building had been constructed by people who understood both craftsmanship and comfort. A dozen or so people sat around various tables, some playing cards, others working on what appeared to be handcraft projects. The atmosphere was relaxed and social, like a gathering of old friends who enjoyed each other's company without need for entertainment or distraction. Dorothy guided me to a quiet corner table and disappeared briefly, returning with 2 steaming mugs of herbal tea that smelled like chamomile and mint. She settled across from me with the careful movements of someone whose joints protested decades of physical labor, but her attention was entirely focused on my face. Nathan told us he was married, she began carefully, but he also said his wife wouldn't understand his need for this place for the work he does here. He was very protective of both worlds, yours and ours, like he was afraid they couldn't coexist. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I stared into my tea, watching steam rise from the surface as I struggled to comprehend what she was telling me. What kind of work does he do here? I mean, I know you said furniture and sculptures, but Nathan works in insurance. He's never shown any interest in woodworking or any kind of craft. Dorothy reached across the table and patted my hand gently. Honey, Nathan is one of the most talented furniture makers I've ever encountered. He comes here every few weeks, sometimes more often, and works in a little cabin workshop about a mile up the ridge. The pieces he creates are extraordinary, the kind of work that takes years to master. He's been studying with Harold, my husband, learning traditional joinery techniques and finishing methods. The room seemed to tilt around me as I tried to reconcile this information with the man I thought I knew. Nathan, learning from masters, dedicating years to developing skills he'd never mentioned, creating art in a secret workshop while telling me he was running errands or meeting college friends. Could you? I asked hesitantly. Could you show me this workshop? I have the key, and I think I need to see what my husband has been doing here. Dorothy studied my face for a long moment, as if weighing whether I was emotionally prepared for whatever revelation awaited. Finally, she nodded and stood, gathering her coat from the back of her chair. Yes, she said simply. I think it's time you saw Nathan's other life. The walk to Nathan's workshop took us along a narrow trail that wound through towering evergreens and moss-covered boulders. Dorothy moved with the sure-footed confidence of someone who'd navigated these paths countless times, while I struggled to keep up in my city shoes, branches catching at my jacket and roots threatening to trip me with every step. The forest here felt ancient and untouched, the kind of wilderness that existed long before humans arrived and would continue long after we were gone. Dorothy kept up a steady stream of conversation as we walked, filling the silence with stories about the Timber Ridge community and how it had evolved over the decades. The area had once been a logging camp, she explained, but when the timber industry moved on, a small group of artists and craftspeople had discovered the abandoned buildings and decided to make them home. They'd slowly transformed the rough structures into workshops and studios, creating a haven for people who valued traditional skills and handmade beauty over mass production and profit margins. "We get all kinds here," Dorothy said, pausing to point out a red-tailed hawk circling overhead. "Potters, weavers, blacksmiths, carpenters. Some are escaping corporate life, others are continuing family traditions. A few, like Nathan, are discovering talents they never knew they had. Harold always says that wood calls to certain people, and when they finally answer, magic happens." The trail began to climb more steeply, and I found myself breathing hard in the thin mountain air. Dorothy seemed unaffected by the elevation, chatting easily about the various workshops scattered throughout the forest, and the seasonal rhythms that governed life in this isolated community. I learned that winter was the most productive time for indoor crafts, when deep snow kept people close to their workshops for months at a time. Spring brought a burst of building and repair work, summer was for gathering materials and hosting the occasional visitor, and fall was harvest time for the gardens that supplemented everyone's simple diet. "There," Dorothy said finally, pointing through a gap in the trees to a small log cabin nestled in a clearing ahead. "That's Nathan's place." The workshop was smaller than I'd expected, maybe 20 feet square, with a steep metal roof and a stone chimney that suggested it could be heated during cold weather. The logs looked hand-hewn rather than milled, fitted together with the kind of precision that spoke of real craftsmanship. A covered porch ran along the front, sheltering what appeared to be workbenches and tool storage. Even from a distance, I could see that this wasn't a hobby shed thrown together on weekends, but a serious workspace designed by someone who understood both function and beauty. My hands trembled as I pulled out the brass key, and Dorothy stepped back respectfully to give me space for this private moment. The lock was old-fashioned but well-maintained, turning smoothly as the key found its home. The door swung open with a slight creak, releasing the scent of wood shavings and linseed oil into the mountain air. Stepping inside Nathan's workshop was like entering a different world, one where my practical, organized husband had been transformed into someone I'd never imagined. The space was filled with tools I didn't recognize, their handles worn smooth from years of use, arranged with the same meticulous precision Nathan brought to everything else in his life. Workbenches lined 2 walls, their surfaces scarred and stained but clean, ready for the next project. Natural light streamed through windows that had been positioned to illuminate the work surfaces without creating harsh shadows, but it was the furniture that took my breath away. Pieces in various stages of completion filled the remaining floor space, each one demonstrating a level of skill and artistry that seemed impossible to reconcile with the man I thought I knew. A dining table in rich walnut stood near the center of the room, its surface smooth as silk and grain patterns flowing like water. Chairs with hand-carved backs and perfectly fitted joints were arranged around it, each one slightly different, but clearly part of a unified design. Along the far wall I discovered smaller pieces that made my heart ache with their beauty. A jewelry box with intricate inlay work that must have taken months to complete. A rocking chair sized for a child, its proportions so perfect and inviting that I could imagine reading bedtime stories in its gentle embrace. A set of wooden bowls nested inside each other, their walls so thin they seemed to glow when I held them up to the light. Dorothy watched from the doorway as I moved through the space, touching surfaces and examining joints with the wonder of someone discovering a hidden treasure. Every piece represented hours of patient work, years of learning and practice that Nathan had somehow fit into a life I thought I knew completely. The quality of the craftsmanship was extraordinary, rivaling pieces I'd seen in expensive galleries and museums. "How long did this take?" I asked, running my fingers along the edge of a small table that seemed to float on impossibly delicate legs. "Nathan's been coming here for about 5 years, Dorothy replied, stepping into the workshop now that I'd had time to absorb the initial shock. "But he's been working seriously for maybe 3. Harold says he's never seen anyone pick up traditional techniques so quickly. It's like Nathan was born to work with wood, but never had the chance to discover. I found myself thinking about all the weekends Nathan had claimed to be running errands or meeting friends, all the times he'd returned home, slightly tired and smelling faintly of something I couldn't identify. Now I realized it had been sawdust and finishing oils, the honest sense of creative work. While I'd been organizing our efficient suburban life, Nathan had been here creating objects of lasting beauty, developing skills and relationships I knew nothing about. Why didn't he tell me? The question came out as barely a whisper, but Dorothy heard it anyway. She moved to stand beside me, her weathered hands gentle as she adjusted the position of a small sculpture on the nearest workbench. "I think Nathan was afraid," she said softly. "Afraid you wouldn't understand why he needed this. Afraid it would seem like a rejection of the life you'd built together. Men of his generation, they sometimes struggle to express creative needs that don't fit traditional expectations." The sculpture Dorothy had touched was an abstract piece carved from what looked like cedar, its flowing lines suggesting movement and growth. Something about its organic curves reminded me of the tree branch engravings on Nathan's key, and I wondered if he'd carved this key himself, a personal symbol of the door between his two worlds. I spent the next hour exploring every corner of the workshop, discovering tools I'd never seen before, and projects in various stages of completion. Nathan had obviously been working on a large cabinet when the accident occurred, its frame assembled but waiting for the intricate door panels that lay ready for installation on a nearby bench. The precision of the joinery was remarkable, traditional mortise and tenon connections cut by hand with tolerances that would challenge modern machinery. In a corner cabinet I found notebooks filled with Nathan's handwriting, documenting techniques he'd learned and ideas for future projects. His normally neat script was looser here, more expressive, accompanied by sketches and diagrams that revealed a visual imagination I'd never suspected. Page after page detailed his progression from simple joints to complex curves, from basic tool use to master-level craftsmanship. One notebook contained what appeared to be a business plan, carefully calculated costs and projected income from selling furniture through craft fairs and galleries. Nathan had been researching the market for handmade furniture, documenting prices and studying successful artisans who'd turned their passion into sustainable income. The thoroughness of his planning was vintage Nathan, but applied to a dream I'd never known he harbored. "He was thinking about making a go of it," Dorothy said, noticing what I was reading. "Harold and I encouraged him to start selling his work, maybe even consider teaching others. He has such a gift for explaining complex techniques in simple terms." The idea of Nathan as a teacher seemed as foreign as everything else I was discovering. My husband had always been impatient with people who couldn't keep up with his thinking, dismissive of what he considered inefficiency or lack of focus. Yet here was evidence that he'd been learning from Harold with obvious respect and gratitude, developing the patience and humility that real craftsmanship demanded. As the afternoon light began to fade, Dorothy suggested we head back to the community center before the mountain trails became too treacherous in the dark. I reluctantly gathered up a few of Nathan's notebooks and locked the workshop door, the weight of everything I'd discovered settling onto my shoulders like a physical burden. The walk back passed in contemplative silence, my mind struggling to process the magnitude of Nathan's secret life and what it meant for our marriage. The community center had transformed during our absence, its main room now filled with people sharing a potluck dinner. The long tables groaned under the weight of homemade dishes, and the conversation was animated and welcoming. Dorothy introduced me to Harold, her husband, a tall man with calloused hands and kind eyes, who immediately expressed concern about Nathan's condition. "He's been like a son to me," Harold said, his voice gruff with emotion. "Never met anyone so eager to learn or so willing to put in the hard work that real craftsmanship requires. How is he doing? Will he recover?" I explained what little I knew about Nathan's prognosis, the uncertainty that surrounded his future, and the impossible decisions I might soon face. Harold listened with the patience of someone accustomed to working with his hands, understanding that some processes couldn't be rushed and some outcomes couldn't be controlled. "Nathan mentioned you once," Harold said carefully. "He said you were the organized one, the one who kept their life running smoothly while he handled the business side of things. He was always grateful for that, said it gave him freedom to pursue other interests, though he never specified what those were." The irony wasn't lost on me. While I'd been managing our household with efficiency and care, Nathan had been developing an entirely separate identity as a craftsman and artist. My organizational skills had indeed given him freedom, but freedom to live a double life rather than freedom to share his passions with me. Over dinner, I found myself drawn into conversations with other members of the Timber Ridge community. Each person had a story about leaving behind conventional expectations to pursue something more meaningful and authentic. Margaret, the potter, had been a successful lawyer before discovering clay in her 50s. James, the blacksmith, had walked away from a career in banking to work with fire and metal. Their stories weren't about rejecting responsibility, but about finding courage to honor deeper callings that conventional life had forced them to suppress. The hardest part, Margaret explained over dessert, isn't learning the new skill. It's unlearning all the ways you've been taught to measure success and value. Out here, we don't care about titles or salaries or keeping up with neighbors. We care about creating something beautiful and useful with our own hands. I thought about our suburban life, the careful balance of appearances and achievements that had defined our marriage. Nathan and I had built what looked like success from the outside, with our comfortable home and stable income and social connections that enhanced our professional reputation. But none of it had room for the kind of authentic creativity I'd witnessed in his workshop, the deep satisfaction that came from mastering traditional skills and creating objects that would outlast their maker. As the evening wound down and people began cleaning up the shared meal, Dorothy invited me to spend the night in their guest room rather than attempting the mountain drive in darkness. Harold supported the suggestion, mentioning that the weather forecast called for possible snow overnight. The offer felt like a gift, a chance to extend my time in this world that Nathan had found so compelling. The Kim's home was a short walk from the community center, a modest house that had clearly been expanded and improved over decades of occupation. Every surface showed evidence of skilled craftsmanship, from the hand-forged door handles to the custom built-in shelving that displayed Dorothy's collection of pottery and weaving. The guest room was simple but welcoming, with a handmade quilt and furniture that matched the quality of Nathan's work. Lying in the unfamiliar bed, I listened to the absolute silence of the mountains, and tried to process everything I'd learned. Nathan wasn't the man I thought I'd married, but he also wasn't a stranger. The precision and attention to detail I'd always admired in him had found new expression in his woodworking. The organizational skills that made him successful in insurance had translated into efficient workshop systems and careful project planning. The Nathan who created beautiful furniture was still the Nathan who managed our household finances with mathematical accuracy. What troubled me most was the realization that Nathan had felt unable to share this passion with me. Had I somehow communicated that his interests needed to conform to my expectations? Had our comfortable routine become a prison that kept him from revealing his authentic self? The questions multiplied in the darkness, each one highlighting ways I might have failed as a partner without even realizing it. Morning arrived with the promised snow, a light dusting that transformed the forest into something from a fairy tale. Dorothy insisted on making a full breakfast, fresh eggs from their chickens and bread baked in a wood-fired oven that filled the kitchen with warmth and the most incredible aroma. Harold joined us at the small table, his presence comfortable and undemanding. "What will you do now?" Dorothy asked as we lingered over coffee. The question had been haunting me since the previous evening. What would I do with this knowledge about Nathan's secret life? How could I reconcile the husband I thought I knew with the craftsman I'd discovered? And most importantly, what did this revelation mean for our future, whether Nathan recovered or not? "I don't know," I admitted. "Part of me feels angry that he didn't trust me enough to share this, but another part is amazed by what he accomplished, proud of the skill he developed. I keep wondering what else I don't know about him, what other parts of himself he felt he had to hide." Harold set down his coffee cup and studied my face with the direct gaze of someone accustomed to seeing through surfaces to underlying structure. "Clara, Nathan talked about you more than you might think. He was always proud of your work at the library, the way you helped people find exactly what they needed. He said you had a gift for understanding what people really wanted, even when they couldn't express it clearly." The observation surprised me. I'd always considered my library work routine and unremarkable, a part-time job that filled our need for supplemental income while giving me something useful to do. The idea that Nathan had noticed and valued my professional skills, even discussed them with his woodworking mentor, revealed another layer of misunderstanding between us. Maybe, Harold continued gently, Nathan was trying to protect something precious by keeping it separate. Sometimes when we're learning new skills, especially creative ones, we need space to make mistakes without judgment. He might have been planning to share this with you once he felt more confident about his ability. I wanted to believe Harold's interpretation, but the evidence suggested Nathan's secrecy went deeper than protecting a fragile new hobby. The business plans, the years of consistent visits, the level of skill he'd achieved all pointed to someone who'd been living a double life, rather than simply exploring a creative interest. The Nathan I'd discovered in that workshop wasn't experimenting with woodworking, he was becoming a different person entirely. After breakfast, Dorothy and Harold offered to show me more of the community, and I found myself eager to understand the world that had captured Nathan's imagination so completely. We visited other workshops and studios scattered throughout the forest, each one revealing different approaches to traditional craftsmanship. The blacksmith's forge was a study in controlled chaos, with half-finished projects and raw materials, organized in systems that made sense only to their creator. The weaver's studio was filled with natural light and colored threads, looms bearing partially completed tapestries that seemed to capture the essence of mountain seasons. Each artisan I met spoke about Nathan with genuine affection and respect. They described someone who listened carefully, asked thoughtful questions, and approached each new technique with the methodical patience that had made him successful in insurance work. But they also talked about his joy in creation, the satisfaction he found in solving problems with his hands, rather than paperwork, the way his entire demeanor changed when he was working with wood. Nathan glows when he's in the zone. Margaret the potter explained as she demonstrated centering clay on her wheel. You can see the stress leaving his body as he focuses on the work. It's like he becomes more himself somehow, more present and authentic. The description resonated with something I'd occasionally glimpsed in Nathan, but never fully understood. Sometimes, usually late at night when he thought I wasn't watching, I'd catch him staring out windows with an expression of longing I couldn't identify. Other times he'd run his hands over furniture in stores or restaurants with unusual attention, as if he was reading something in the wood grain that escaped my notice. I'd attributed these moments to fatigue or distraction, never suspecting they revealed deeper hungers our suburban life couldn't satisfy. By midday, the snow had stopped and the roads were clear enough for travel, but I found myself reluctant to leave. The Timber Ridge community had welcomed me with a warmth and acceptance I hadn't expected, treating me not as an outsider and investigating their friend's secret, but as someone who belonged simply by virtue of caring about Nathan. Their assumption that I would understand and appreciate what he'd built here was both touching and challenging, forcing me to examine my own capacity for supporting the unconventional and unexpected. Dorothy walked me back to my car, her presence a steady comfort as I prepared to return to the world of hospitals and difficult decisions. The brass key felt different in my pocket now, no longer mysterious but weighted with knowledge and responsibility. I understood what it opened, but I still didn't know what I was supposed to do with that understanding. The workshop will wait, Dorothy said as I settled behind the steering wheel. Nathan built it to last and his tools are safe there. When you're ready, whether he recovers or not, you'll know what needs to happen next. The drive back to Portland passed in a blur of mountain scenery and churning thoughts. I'd left the city searching for answers about a mysterious key and a husband I didn't really know. I was returning with answers I wasn't sure I wanted, knowledge that complicated every assumption about our marriage and future. Nathan had found something in Timber Ridge that our conventional life couldn't provide, something important enough to justify years of careful deception. The hospital felt foreign and sterile after 2 days in the mountains, its fluorescent lights harsh after the natural illumination of Nathan's workshop. I made my way to his room, where machines continued their patient work of keeping his body alive while we waited for some sign that his mind remained intact. He looked smaller somehow, more fragile, as if the knowledge I'd gained had revealed the limitations of the man I'd thought was so capable and self-sufficient. I pulled up a chair beside his bed and began talking, describing everything I'd discovered about his secret life. I told him about Dorothy and Harold, about the incredible furniture he'd created, about the community that had embraced him and valued his contributions. I talked about my confusion and hurt, but also about my amazement at the skills he'd developed and the beauty he'd brought into the world. The words poured out of me for hours, all the questions and revelations and emotions I'd been carrying since finding the key. Nathan's face remained peaceful and unresponsive, but I continued anyway, needing to voice everything I'd learned whether he could hear me or not. Somewhere in that one-sided conversation, I began to understand that the knowledge I'd gained wasn't just about Nathan's secret life, but about my own capacity for growth and change. The man lying in that hospital bed had managed to reinvent himself while maintaining his responsibilities to our marriage and household. He'd found space for creativity and passion within the constraints of conventional life, even if he'd done it through deception rather than honest communication. If Nathan could transform himself from an insurance adjuster into a master craftsman, what possibilities existed for my own unexplored potential? That night, alone in our suburban house, I began making plans of my own. The following Monday morning brought an unexpected phone call from Dr. Martina. Nathan's brain activity had increased overnight, showing patterns that suggested he might be beginning to emerge from the coma. She cautioned that recovery would be slow and uncertain, but for the first time since the accident, there was genuine hope that he might regain consciousness. I rushed to the hospital with my heart pounding, clutching Nathan's workshop notebooks that I'd been reading obsessively since my return from Timber Ridge. The doctors explained that coma patients often experienced periods of increased activity that didn't necessarily indicate imminent awakening, but Nathan's responses to stimuli had become more consistent and purposeful over the past 12 hours. Sitting beside his bed, I watched for any sign of awareness, any flutter of eyelids, or movement of fingers that might signal his return to consciousness. The machines continued their rhythmic beeping, but something about Nathan's breathing seemed different, less mechanical and more natural. I began reading aloud from his notebooks, describing the techniques he'd documented and the projects he'd planned, hoping that familiar concepts might reach whatever part of his mind remained active. "You were working on a cabinet when the accident happened," I said softly, turning pages filled with his careful sketches. "The frame is beautiful, Nathan. Harold says the joinery is some of the finest work he's ever seen. Dorothy wants to know if you'd plan to use book-matched panels for the doors, because the grain pattern would be spectacular." I wasn't sure if Nathan could hear me, but the act of speaking about his woodworking felt natural and necessary. For years I'd filled our conversations with details about my library work and household concerns, while Nathan listened politely and offered appropriate responses. Now I understood that I'd been monopolizing our communication, never creating space for him to share the passion that truly animated his life. The irony was sharp and uncomfortable. I'd always prided myself on being a good listener at work, helping library patrons articulate their research needs and guiding them toward resources they didn't know existed. Yet I'd failed to hear the deeper longings of my own husband, the creative hunger that drove him to seek fulfillment in secret workshops and borrowed time. 2 days later, Nathan's eyes opened for the first time since the accident. The moment was less dramatic than I'd imagined during my long vigil, just a gradual flutter of lashes followed by confused blinking as he tried to focus on unfamiliar surroundings. I pressed the call button for the nurses while leaning close to his face, tears streaming down my cheeks as I whispered his name. The medical team descended quickly, checking vital signs and conducting basic neurological assessments while I hovered anxiously nearby. Nathan's responses were slow but appropriate, following simple commands and answering basic questions about his name and location. Martinez explained that full cognitive recovery could take weeks or months, and there was no way to predict whether he'd experience lasting effects from the brain injury. Nathan's first clear words to me were an apology. "Clara," he whispered through dry lips, "I'm sorry about the meeting. I know you worried when I was late." The simplicity of his concern, the immediate guilt about causing me inconvenience, broke my heart in ways I hadn't expected. Even semi-conscious and struggling with basic communication, Nathan's first instinct was to protect me from anxiety rather than seek comfort for himself. The pattern was so fundamentally him that I recognized the essential person remained intact despite the trauma. "Don't worry about that now," I said, smoothing his hair back from his forehead. "Just focus on getting better. Everything else can wait," but everything else couldn't wait. Not really. Nathan's slow emergence from the coma coincided with my own accelerating transformation, changes I'd set in motion during the weeks of his unconsciousness that couldn't be easily reversed. I'd made decisions about my work, our home, and my future that assumed Nathan might not recover. Decisions that reflected the person I was becoming, rather than the person I'd been when he left for his mysterious meeting. The first change had been practical and necessary. With Nathan's income interrupted and mounting medical bills, I'd needed to find additional work to maintain our financial stability. Instead of seeking a second part-time position in retail or food service, I'd responded to a posting at the library for a full-time reference librarian position that had been vacant for months. The pay increase was substantial, but more importantly, the work engaged skills and interests I'd allowed to atrophy during years of part-time employment. My new position involved coordinating research assistance for university students and faculty, developing specialized resource guides, and teaching information literacy workshops. The intellectual challenges were stimulating in ways I'd forgotten were possible, requiring me to stay current with emerging technologies and academic disciplines, far beyond my original training. For the first time in years, I found myself excited about Monday mornings, eager to tackle complex research problems and help students discover connections between disparate fields of knowledge. The second change had been emotional and unexpected. Working closely with graduate students and professors had reminded me of my own abandoned academic ambitions, dreams I'd set aside when Nathan and I married, and I'd prioritized his career advancement over my own educational goal. I'd begun auditing evening courses at the university, initially telling myself it was professional development, but gradually acknowledging deeper motivations. The literature and history classes I attended sparked intellectual passions I'd suppressed for over a decade. Discussions about social movements and artistic innovation reminded me of the idealistic young woman who'd once planned to pursue graduate study in American studies, focusing on the intersection of craft traditions and cultural identity. That woman had been buried under years of practical concerns and social expectations, but she hadn't disappeared entirely. Nathan's recovery progressed steadily but slowly, his cognitive abilities returning in unpredictable ways. Some days he was sharp and articulate, discussing insurance cases with the clarity and precision I remembered. Other days he struggled with basic concepts, becoming frustrated when words wouldn't come, or memories remained elusive. The doctors assured us that this pattern was normal, that brain healing followed its own timeline and couldn't be rushed. During his clearer moments, I began sharing some of what I'd discovered about his woodworking life. I started carefully, mentioning my visit to Timber Ridge without revealing the extent of my exploration or the depth of knowledge I'd gained about his secret world. Nathan's reaction was immediate and complex, a mixture of relief and anxiety that suggested he'd been carrying the burden of his double life for years. "You went to the workshop?" he asked during one afternoon visit, his voice stronger than it had been since awakening. "Dorothy and Harold showed me around," I said, watching his face carefully for any sign of distress. "Your furniture is incredible, Nathan. I had no idea you were so talented." His eyes filled with tears and for several minutes he couldn't speak. When he finally found words, they came in a rush of explanation and justification that revealed how much guilt he'd been carrying about his deception. "I wanted to tell you," he said, gripping my hand with surprising strength. "So many times I almost explained where I was really going, what I was learning to do, but it seemed so selfish, spending money on tools and materials when we were trying to save for a house renovation, and I wasn't sure I was any good at it. Didn't want to seem foolish chasing dreams at my age." The vulnerability in his confession was heartbreaking, but it also revealed assumptions about our relationship that I was only beginning to understand. Nathan had been protecting what he saw as an impractical hobby, convinced that I would view his creative pursuits as frivolous or financially irresponsible. He'd created elaborate deceptions, rather than risk my disappointment or judgment, never considering that I might support and celebrate his artistic development. "Nathan," I said gently, "I would have been proud of you for pursuing something you were passionate about. The furniture you made is museum quality. Why did you think I wouldn't understand?" His answer revealed the depth of miscommunication that had characterized our marriage for years. Nathan had interpreted my efficiency and practical nature as indications that I valued security and convention above all else. My focus on household management and financial planning had convinced him that I would see artistic pursuits as distractions from more important responsibility. He'd been protecting his creative life from what he perceived as my practical disapproval, never recognizing that my organizational skills could have supported, rather than threatened, his artistic development. The irony was profound and painful. While Nathan had been hiding his creative passions to preserve our financial stability, I'd been suppressing my intellectual ambitions to support what I thought were his conventional expectations. We'd spent years protecting each other from dreams we'd never shared, creating a marriage that felt safe but left both of us profoundly unfulfilled. As Nathan's recovery continued, I began sharing my own recent changes and discoveries. I told him about my new position at the library, the courses I'd been auditing, the intellectual excitement I'd rediscovered. His reaction surprised me with its enthusiasm and support, as if he'd been waiting years for me to pursue interest beyond our household routine. "I always wondered why you settled for part-time work," he admitted during one conversation. "You're brilliant, Clara. I watched you help people at the library and thought you could run the whole university if they'd let you. But when I suggested you consider more challenging positions, you always said you were happy with things as they were." Another layer of misunderstanding revealed itself. Nathan had been encouraging my professional development in ways I'd misinterpreted as pressure or dissatisfaction with my contributions to our household. When he'd mentioned career opportunities or suggested I consider graduate school, I'd heard criticism of my choices rather than support for my potential. We'd been speaking different languages while using the same words, each of us trying to be supportive in ways the other couldn't recognize or appreciate. The weeks of Nathan's recovery became a time of mutual rediscovery, as we slowly revealed the people we'd become during years of careful concealment. I learned that Nathan had been following my library work more closely than I'd realized, taking pride in my professional accomplishments, and hoping I'd find opportunities to expand my influence. He learned that I'd been monitoring his moods and energy levels, noticing his restlessness and wondering what might bring him greater satisfaction than the insurance work that had become routine and uninspiring. Physical therapy sessions provided opportunities for deeper conversations. As Nathan worked to regain strength and coordination, the brain injury had affected his fine motor control, making the precise movements required for woodworking uncertain. We discussed whether he'd be able to return to craftsmanship at his previous level, what adaptations might be necessary, and how his physical limitations might affect his plans for the future. "Maybe this is a sign," Nathan said one afternoon, struggling to complete exercises that required delicate finger movements. "Maybe I was fooling myself thinking I could become a real furniture maker. Insurance work doesn't require the same precision." His resignation troubled me more than his physical struggles. The Nathan I'd discovered in Timber Ridge had been passionate and determined, willing to spend years mastering difficult techniques, because the work itself brought him joy. This version of my husband seemed ready to abandon his artistic development at the first sign of difficulty, retreating to the safety of work that no longer challenged or inspired him. "Harold called yesterday," I said, pulling out my phone to show Nathan a photo Dorothy had sent. "He wanted you to see the cabinet you were working on. He finished the door panels using your measurements and techniques. He said it's some of the finest work that's ever come out of his shop." The image showed Nathan's cabinet completed, its book-matched panels displaying grain patterns that seemed to flow like water across the wood's surface. The piece was undeniably beautiful, demonstrating mastery of traditional techniques, combined with innovative design sensibility. Nathan stared at the photo for a long time, and I watched years of accumulated skill and knowledge war with present limitations and fear. "I don't know if my hands will ever be steady enough for that kind of work again," he said finally. "Then we'll figure out what's possible now," I replied. "Maybe your approach needs to change, but that doesn't mean your passion has to disappear." Dorothy mentioned that some of the most respected craftspeople she knows developed their signature styles by working around physical limitations. The conversation marked a turning point in Nathan's recovery, shifting his focus from what he might have lost to what remained possible. Over the following weeks, we began planning his return to woodworking with realistic assessments of his current abilities and potential adaptation. Harold visited the hospital to discuss modifications to tools and techniques that could accommodate reduced fine motor control, while Dorothy brought examples of work by artisans who developed innovative approaches to traditional craft. My own transformation accelerated during this period, as I realized that supporting Nathan's artistic recovery required me to embrace changes I'd already set in motion. The full-time library position had become essential, not just for financial reasons, but because Nathan's medical expenses and reduced income meant I needed to become our primary breadwinner for the foreseeable future. The courses I'd been auditing transformed from personal enrichment to practical preparation for career advancement. The university's American Studies program had accepted my application for graduate study, beginning in the fall semester, contingent on my completion of prerequisite courses I'd been taking throughout the spring. The decision to pursue a master's degree had emerged gradually from my coursework, as professors encouraged my research interests and suggested academic paths I'd never considered possible. Nathan's accident had forced me to confront questions about my future that I might have avoided indefinitely under normal circumstances. "I'm proud of you," Nathan said when I finally shared the news about graduate school. "I know this isn't how either of us planned things, but maybe that's okay. Maybe we needed something to shake us out of the routines we'd settled into." His support meant everything, but it also highlighted how much our marriage had changed during the months of his recovery. We were becoming different people, shaped by crisis and revelation in ways that made our old patterns of interaction obsolete. The comfortable predictability that had once defined our relationship was being replaced by uncertainty and possibility that felt both exciting and terrifying. Nathan's discharge from the hospital came in early summer, 3 months after the accident that had changed everything. He returned to a house that felt different, not because anything physical had changed, but because we'd both grown beyond the spaces we'd previously occupied. Our suburban home suddenly seemed too small and conventional for the lives we were beginning to imagine for ourselves. The first few weeks of Nathan's return were challenging as we adjusted to new routines and limitations. His stamina was limited, requiring frequent rest periods and careful management of cognitive demands. I balanced my library work with graduate course preparations, while providing the support Nathan needed for continued recovery. The practical challenges were significant, but they paled compared to the emotional work of rebuilding our relationship on foundations of honesty rather than protection. Nathan's first return visit to Timber Ridge was emotional for both of us. Harold and Dorothy welcomed him with joy and concern, immediately beginning discussions about workshop modifications that could accommodate his current abilities. The community had preserved his projects and maintained his tools, creating a seamless transition back to the work that had become central to his identity. Watching Nathan examine his unfinished pieces and reconnect with his mentor was both heartbreaking and inspiring. His movements were slower and less precise than before the accident, but his understanding of wood and technique remained intact. Harold suggested starting with simpler projects that relied more on design sense than fine motor control, gradually rebuilding confidence and physical ability through patient practice. I found myself drawn into conversations about craft traditions and artistic innovation, topics that connected surprisingly well with my academic interests in American cultural history. Dorothy encouraged me to consider writing about the Timber Ridge community for my graduate thesis, documenting how contemporary artisans maintain traditional skills while adapting to modern economic and social pressures. The suggestion sparked an idea that had been developing since my first visit to Nathan's workshop. I'd been searching for a thesis topic that would combine my library research skills with emerging interests in craft studies and cultural preservation. The story of how people like Nathan discovered artistic callings later in life, and how communities like Timber Ridge supported that development, seemed to offer rich possibilities for academic exploration. Over the summer, I began conducting informal interviews with Timber Ridge artisans, documenting their stories of transformation and the factors that had drawn them to traditional craft. Each conversation revealed patterns of dissatisfaction with conventional work, discovery of creative potential, and gradual integration into communities that valued handmade objects and traditional skill. Nathan's story was unique in its details, but representative of broader cultural currents that drew people toward authentic creative expression. The research process was revealing in personal as well as academic ways. Speaking with people who'd successfully navigated major life transitions provided models for the changes Nathan and I were attempting in our own lives. Their stories demonstrated that midlife career changes and identity shifts, while challenging, could lead to greater fulfillment and authentic self-expression. Margaret the Potter had been particularly generous with her time and insights, sharing the practical and emotional challenges of leaving legal practice to become a full-time artist. Her advice about managing financial uncertainty and family skepticism was invaluable, as Nathan and I considered how his woodworking might evolve from passionate hobby to primary livelihood. The hardest part isn't learning new skills, Margaret had explained during one interview session. It's unlearning old definitions of success and security. When you've spent decades measuring worth through salary and status, it takes time to find satisfaction in simpler but more meaningful achievement. Her words resonated deeply with both Nathan and me, as we struggled to envision futures that prioritized creative fulfillment over conventional markers of success. Nathan's insurance career had provided financial stability and social respectability, but it had never engaged his deeper talents or passions. My library work was satisfying but limited in scope, offering insufficient challenge for my intellectual capability. The question we faced was whether we had the courage to pursue more authentic but uncertain paths, whether individually or together. Nathan's accident had forced us to confront these issues more rapidly than we might have chosen, but it had also provided clarity about what really mattered in our lives. By late summer, we'd made several tentative decisions about our future direction. Nathan would continue his insurance work part-time while rebuilding his woodworking skills and exploring possibilities for selling his furniture. I would begin graduate school while maintaining my full-time library position, with the goal of eventually pursuing academic or museum career paths that could utilize my research skills more fully. The plan required careful financial management and significant lifestyle adjustments, but it offered something our previous life had lacked: alignment between our daily activities and our authentic interests and abilities. We were no longer protecting each other from imagined disappointments, but actively supporting each other's growth toward more fulfilling lives. Nathan's progress in the workshop that summer was remarkable, though different from his pre-accident development. His reduced fine motor control forced him to focus on larger pieces with bolder designs, furniture that emphasized grain patterns and proportions rather than intricate detail. The results were stunning in their simplicity and power, revealing an artistic maturity that might not have emerged through his previous technical focus alone. Harold observed that Nathan's accident had freed him from perfectionist tendencies that had sometimes limited his creative expression. "He's not trying to prove anything anymore," the old craftsman noted. "He's just making beautiful objects because that's what brings him joy. That's when the real artistry emerges." The observation applied to more than just Nathan's woodwork. Both of us were discovering that crisis had stripped away pretensions and social expectations that had constrained our choices for years. We were finding courage to pursue paths that felt authentic rather than impressive, meaningful rather than conventional. As summer ended and I prepared to begin graduate school, Nathan surprised me with a project he'd been working on secretly in Harold's workshop. It was a writing desk designed specifically for my needs, with perfect proportions for laptop use and carefully planned storage for research materials and books. The wood was local maple with subtle figure that would age beautifully, and every joint showed the careful attention to detail that characterized Nathan's finest work. "I wanted to make something that would support your studies," he explained, as I ran my hands over the silky surface. "Something that would remind you every day that I believe in what you're doing, that I'm proud of the person you're becoming." The desk was more than furniture. It was a symbol of our reconstructed marriage, built on foundations of mutual support rather than mutual protection. Nathan had created something beautiful to encourage my intellectual development, just as I was learning to support his artistic growth without reservation or judgment. Sitting at that desk to begin my first graduate seminar papers, I reflected on how much had changed since I'd found a mysterious key in Nathan's jacket pocket. We'd both unlocked doors to rooms in ourselves we'd never explored, discovering capabilities and desires we'd hidden, even from each other. The process had been painful and uncertain, but it had led us toward lives that felt more authentic and connected. The key that had started everything now hung on a small hook above my new desk, no longer mysterious but still meaningful as a reminder of how much we didn't know about the people closest to us, and how much growth remained possible even in relationships we thought we fully understood. The first semester of graduate school challenged me in ways I hadn't anticipated. Academic writing required different skills than the reference guides and research summaries I'd produced at the library, demanding theoretical frameworks and analytical depth that stretched my intellectual muscles after years of practical work. My professors were encouraging but exacting, expecting scholarly rigor that pushed me beyond comfortable competence into genuine growth. My thesis advisor, Dr. Patricia Holloway, was a renowned expert in American material culture whose own background bridged academic theory and hands-on craft knowledge. She'd spent summers working with traditional potters in North Carolina and weavers in New Mexico, bringing experiential understanding to her scholarly analysis of how artisan communities preserved and transmitted cultural knowledge. Her approach to research resonated perfectly with my developing interest in documenting the Timber Ridge community. "You have unusual access to an active craft community," Dr. Holloway observed during one of our early meetings. "Most scholars study historical artisan groups through archives and artifacts. You're witnessing cultural transmission in real time, watching people discover and develop traditional skills that connect them to centuries of accumulated knowledge." The academic framework gave new meaning to my observations of Nathan's transformation and the stories I'd gathered from other Timber Ridge artisans. Their individual journeys toward craft mastery represented broader cultural phenomena, responses to industrialization, and mass production that drove people to seek authentic creative expression through traditional methods. My research proposal focused on what I termed late-life craft adoption, examining the factors that led established professionals to embrace traditional artisan skills as primary or secondary career. The preliminary interviews I'd conducted suggested patterns of dissatisfaction with corporate culture, longing for tangible creative output, and desire for community connections that contemporary suburban life often failed to provide. Nathan became my most detailed case study, his story offering intimate access to the psychological and practical challenges of major midlife transition. His willingness to discuss his motivations and obstacles provided insights I couldn't have gained through formal interviews with other community members. The academic distance required for scholarly analysis was challenging when writing about my own husband, but Dr. Holloway helped me develop approaches that maintained objectivity while utilizing my unique perspective. The writing process forced me to examine our marriage transformation with analytical rigor that was both painful and illuminating. Documenting the years of miscommunication and concealed longings required confronting my own role in creating the conditions that made Nathan feel unable to share his authentic interest. Academic honesty demanded acknowledging how my assumptions and expectations had contributed to the very problems I was studying. Nathan's woodworking continued evolving throughout my first semester, his style developing in directions that reflected both his physical limitations and his deepening artistic maturity. The pieces he completed showed growing confidence in bold, simplified forms that emphasized wood grain and proportional relationships rather than complex joinery detail. Harold praised this evolution, noting that many master craftsmen took decades to achieve the kind of design clarity Nathan was developing through necessity. The Cascade Artisan Market became Nathan's primary venue for selling his work, a monthly gathering in a converted warehouse where regional craftspeople displayed furniture, pottery, textiles, and other handmade goods. The market attracted customers who valued traditional craftsmanship and were willing to pay premium prices for objects that would last generations rather than seasons. Nathan's first market experience was nerve-wracking for both of us. Years of creating for personal satisfaction and Harold's approval hadn't prepared him for the vulnerability of exposing his work to strangers who might judge it purely on aesthetic and functional merit. I helped him transport pieces and arrange his display, watching nervously as potential customers examined joints and tested drawer slides with the discriminating attention of people who understood quality construction. The response exceeded our cautious expectations. Nathan sold 3 pieces during that first market day, including a coffee table that attracted multiple interested buyers and generated a waiting list for similar design. Customers appreciated the clean lines and understated elegance of his work, praising the way his furniture would complement contemporary interiors without demanding attention through ornate detail. More importantly, Nathan discovered that he enjoyed talking with customers about his techniques and design choices. Years of insurance work had developed his ability to explain complex concepts in accessible terms, skills that translated beautifully to discussing wood selection, joinery methods, and the reasoning behind specific design decisions. Potential buyers found his knowledge and passion compelling, often spending much longer at his display than initially intended. The market community itself proved as valuable as the sales opportunity. Nathan connected with other furniture makers whose approaches differed from Harold's traditional methods, exposing him to contemporary innovations and alternative techniques that broadened his perspective on craft possibilities. The informal mentorship network that developed among market vendors provided ongoing education and support that complemented his mountain workshop training. Margaret the Potter had been prophetic about the challenges of redefining success measures. Nathan struggled with the financial uncertainty of depending on craft sales, even part-time, after years of steady insurance income. Market days could generate substantial revenue or complete disappointment, depending on factors beyond his control like weather, competing events, or simple variations in customer preference. I found myself becoming his business manager by necessity, applying organizational skills developed through library work to tracking expenses, managing inventory, and developing marketing material. The role felt natural and fulfilling, utilizing my systematic approach to support Nathan's creative work rather than constraining it. We discovered that our different strengths complemented each other beautifully when aligned toward shared goals rather than separate agendas. My graduate coursework in museum studies proved unexpectedly relevant to Nathan's craft business development. Classes in exhibition design and cultural interpretation provided frameworks for presenting handmade objects in ways that communicated their artistic and historical significance to potential buyers. I began creating display materials that contextualized Nathan's work within broader traditions of American furniture making, helping customers understand the value of traditional techniques in contemporary application. The intersection of my academic interests and Nathan's artistic development created synergies we hadn't anticipated. Research for my thesis introduced me to craft communities across the country, whose experiences and innovations provided models for Timber Ridge's future development. I shared relevant articles and case studies with Dorothy and Harold, contributing to discussions about how their community might evolve while maintaining its core values. Winter brought both challenges and opportunities for our transformed lives. Nathan's workshop time increased as outdoor activities became less appealing, allowing him to focus intensively on developing new designs and refining his adapted technique. The forced indoor time also provided space for deeper conversations about our future direction, discussions that had been postponed during the crisis of his recovery and my rapid life change. We began talking seriously about relocating to be closer to Timber Ridge, recognizing that weekend visits limited Nathan's full integration into the craft community that had become central to his identity. The suburban house that had once represented achievement and stability now felt like a barrier to the life we were building, its mortgage payments and maintenance requirements tying us to conventional patterns we no longer value. The possibility of relocation raised complex questions about my graduate program and library career. Portland State University offered excellent resources for my thesis research, and my full-time position provided the income stability our transition required. Moving to rural Washington would mean commuting significant distances, or finding new employment opportunities that might not exist in remote mountain communities. Dr. Holloway suggested an alternative approach that could accommodate both our needs. Several universities offered low residency graduate programs that required only brief campus visits while allowing students to complete most coursework and research from distant locations. The flexibility of such programs was designed for working professionals who couldn't relocate for traditional full-time study, exactly our situation. The prospect of finishing my degree through distance learning while living near Timber Ridge opened possibilities we hadn't considered. Rural libraries often needed qualified professionals willing to work in isolated communities, and my specialized skills in research and information literacy could be valuable assets in underserved areas. The income might be lower than my current position, but our living expenses would decrease proportionally in a less expensive region. Nathan's enthusiasm for potential relocation was infectious, but I needed time to research practical implications before making commitments that would affect both our future. The academic year provided natural deadlines for decision-making, allowing me to complete my current coursework while exploring transfer options and investigating employment possibilities in the Timber Ridge area. Spring semester brought unexpected validation for both our evolving careers. Nathan received his first commission for a custom dining set, a project that would challenge his technical abilities while providing income equivalent to several months of market sale. The clients had discovered his work through the artisan market and specifically requested furniture that would showcase traditional joinery techniques in contemporary form. The commission represented everything Nathan had hoped his craft might become: financially viable work that utilized his highest skills while creating objects of lasting beauty and utility. The pressure was intense, but Harold agreed to collaborate on the most technically demanding elements, ensuring the project would meet both artistic and functional requirements. My thesis research had progressed to the point where Dr. Holloway suggested presenting preliminary findings at a regional conference on American material culture. The opportunity to share my work with other scholars was both exciting and terrifying, marking my emergence as a genuine researcher rather than a student completing assignments. The conference presentation would also provide networking opportunities that could prove valuable for future academic or museum career development. The paper I developed for the conference examined how contemporary craft communities like Timber Ridge functioned as cultural preservation networks, maintaining traditional knowledge while adapting to modern economic and social conditions. Nathan's story anchored the presentation, but I'd expanded the analysis to include interviews with artisans across the Pacific Northwest, whose experiences revealed similar patterns of career transition and community formation. Preparing the presentation required synthesizing months of research into a coherent argument that would engage academic audiences while honoring the personal stories that had made the work meaningful. The challenge pushed my writing and analytical skills beyond anything I'd attempted previously, demanding clarity and sophistication that reflected genuine scholarly expertise. Nathan insisted on attending the conference to hear my presentation despite his nervousness about academic settings and formal scholarly discourse. His presence in the audience provided moral support that made the intimidating experience manageable, and his genuine pride in my accomplishment meant more than any professional recognition could have offered. The presentation was well received, generating questions and comments that suggested my research addressed important gaps in existing scholarship. Several conference attendees approached me afterward to discuss their own work on craft communities and traditional knowledge preservation, beginning conversations that would continue throughout my graduate career. Dr. Chen, a curator from the National Museum of American History, was particularly interested in my documentation of contemporary craft adoption patterns. Her museum was developing an exhibition on 21st-century artisan communities, and she suggested my research could contribute valuable perspectives on how traditional skills remained relevant in digital-age careers. The conversation with Dr. Chen opened possibilities I'd never considered for my post-graduation future. Museum work had always seemed impossibly competitive and geographically constrained, requiring residence in major metropolitan areas where such institutions concentrate. Learning that my rural craft community research had national relevance suggested career paths that could accommodate our desire for less conventional life choices. Summer arrived with major decisions looming about our location, my educational direction, and Nathan's craft business development. The custom dining set commission had been completed successfully, generating additional requests for similar work that suggested his reputation was building beyond local market. The income from craft sales was approaching the level where Nathan could consider leaving insurance work entirely, a prospect that both excited and terrified him. My graduate program offered the transfer flexibility Holloway had suggested, and I'd identified a low residency option at the University of Washington that would allow me to complete my degree while living anywhere in the state. The program specialized in public history and museum studies, providing exactly the training I'd need for the kind of cultural work that increasingly interested me. The final catalyst for our decision came from an unexpected source. Dorothy called one evening to report that the house adjacent to their property had become available for purchase, a modest cabin that could be expanded to accommodate year-round residents. The previous owners had used it as a vacation retreat, but economic pressures were forcing a sale that represented an opportunity for someone willing to invest in rural mountain living. Nathan and I drove to Timber Ridge the following weekend to examine the property, bringing measuring tools and notebooks to assess its potential seriously. The cabin was smaller than our suburban house but beautifully situated among old-growth trees with southern exposure that would provide natural light for both workshop and study activities. The structure was sound but needed updating for full-time occupancy, projects that would allow Nathan to apply his woodworking skills to our own living space. Harold and Dorothy's enthusiastic support for our potential relocation provided the emotional security we needed to consider such a dramatic change. Their offer to help with renovation work and their obvious delight at the prospect of having us as permanent neighbors tipped the balance toward a decision we'd been approaching cautiously for months. The financial calculations were challenging but workable. Selling our Portland house would provide enough capital to purchase the mountain property and fund necessary improvements, while eliminating mortgage payments that had constrained our choices for years. Nathan's craft income was growing steadily, and my library skills were portable to rural communities that often struggled to find qualified professionals. More importantly, the move would align our living situation with the values and priorities we'd discovered through our separate transformations. Instead of spending weekends traveling between our suburban life and the mountain community that truly engaged us, we could integrate fully into the place that had become central to our identities. The decision, once made, required months of careful planning and execution. Our Portland house needed preparation for sale, a process that involved decluttering years of accumulated possessions and making repairs we'd deferred while focused on other priorities. Every object we'd purchased for our conventional life required evaluation. Would it fit our new space and lifestyle, or was it another symbol of expectations we no longer shared? The sorting process was therapeutic and revealing, highlighting how much of our previous life had been oriented toward impressing others rather than satisfying ourselves. Expensive furniture that looked impressive but felt uncomfortable, books we'd bought to appear intellectual but never read, kitchen gadgets that had seemed essential but remained unused in drawers for years. Nathan's perspective on material possessions had been permanently altered by his craft training. He now evaluated objects based on construction quality, material honesty, and functional efficiency rather than brand prestige or fashion trends. The standards he applied to his own work had become criteria for everything we chose to keep or acquire. My academic research had similarly influenced my relationship with material culture, making me more conscious of how objects reflected and shaped social identity. The books, furniture, and decorative items we surrounded ourselves with communicated messages about our values and aspirations, both to visitors and to ourselves. The house sale proceeded more smoothly than expected, helped by a strong real estate market and the improvements we'd made over the years. The proceeds exceeded our projections, providing financial cushioning for the transition period while Nathan's craft business grew and I completed my degree through the new program. Our final weeks in Portland were bittersweet, filled with farewells to friends and colleagues who struggled to understand our decision to abandon successful careers for uncertain rural adventure. Some expressed envy for our courage to pursue authentic interests, while others worried we were making impractical choices that we'd eventually regret. The skepticism was understandable, given how dramatically our new direction differed from conventional career trajectory. Nathan was leaving steady employment with good benefits to become a full-time craftsman, whose income would depend on market demand and seasonal variation. I was exchanging a secure library position for uncertain rural opportunities, while pursuing graduate education that might never translate into comparable employment. Yet the concerns that loomed large for our suburban friends felt manageable from our current perspective. The financial security we'd spent years building had come at the cost of creative fulfillment and authentic self-expression. The risks of pursuing our genuine interests seemed preferable to the certainty of continued dissatisfaction with conventional success. Moving day arrived with a mixture of excitement and anxiety that reflected the magnitude of change we were undertaking. Professional movers handled our reduced household goods, while Nathan transported his tools and I packed research materials and books that would anchor my studies in our new location. The familiar landmarks of our Portland life disappeared in rearview mirrors as we drove toward an uncertain but authentic future. the mountain cabin welcomed us with late summer light filtering through trees that would soon explode into autumn color. Dorothy and Harold had prepared a welcoming meal and recruited other community members to help with unloading and initial settling. The immediate integration into Timber Ridge social networks made the transition feel less like displacement and more like homecoming. Nathan's first priority was establishing a workshop in the cabin's basement, a space that required significant modification to accommodate serious furniture making. Harold provided guidance on lighting, ventilation, and tool arrangement, while community members contributed lumber and hardware from their own projects. The collaborative nature of the work exemplified the mutual support that characterized Timber Ridge relationship. My study space emerged in the cabin's loft, where dormers provided natural light and mountain views that would inspire rather than distract from academic work. The isolation that concerned some of our Portland friends actually enhanced my ability to focus on research and writing, eliminating the social and professional distractions that had fragmented my attention in the city. The first month of mountain living confirmed that we'd made the right choice despite ongoing challenges and adjustments. Nathan's workshop productivity increased dramatically once he wasn't spending hours commuting between his tools and our home. My academic work benefited from the quiet focus that rural living provided, and my thesis research gained depth from daily immersion in the community I was studying in. The seasonal transition into autumn brought our first experience of the mountain's dramatic weather changes and the community's responses to environmental challenges. Winter preparation required different skills and priorities than suburban living, demanding competencies in wood heating, water system maintenance, and emergency preparedness that stretched our urban background. Yet these challenges also provided opportunities for integration into community networks that shared resources and knowledge freely. Neighbors offered instruction in practical skills while accepting our contributions in areas where our professional backgrounds provided value. The reciprocal relationships that developed felt more authentic and meaningful than the superficial connections that had characterized much of our suburban social life. Nathan's craft business thrived in the rural setting, both through increased productivity and expanded customer network. The mountain location attracted visitors specifically seeking handmade goods, and his workshop became a destination for people interested in observing traditional techniques and commissioning custom pieces. The integration of his business with our living situation eliminated artificial separations that had complicated his previous double life. My thesis research gained national attention through the conference presentation and subsequent publications, establishing my emerging reputation as a scholar of contemporary craft movement. The work attracted consulting opportunities with museums and cultural organizations interested in documenting and supporting traditional artisan community. As our first winter approached, Nathan and I reflected on the extraordinary year that had transformed us from a conventional suburban couple hiding our true interest from each other into authentic partners supporting each other's creative and intellectual development. The mysterious key that had started everything now hung in our mountain cabin, no longer a symbol of secrets, but a reminder of how much growth remained possible when people found courage to unlock their authentic selves. The challenges ahead were significant but exciting. Nathan's business development, my degree completion, and our continued integration into a community that valued creativity and authenticity over conventional markers of success. Yet the foundation we'd built through honest communication and mutual support felt strong enough to weather whatever difficulties awaited. We discovered that the greatest risk wasn't pursuing uncertain dreams, but accepting the certainty of lives that never fully expressed our deepest capabilities and interests. The key Nathan had carried secretly for years had opened far more than a workshop door. It had unlocked possibilities for authentic living that neither of us had imagined possible within the constraints of our conventional merit. 2 years after finding the mysterious key in Nathan's pocket, I stood in the National Museum of American History, watching visitors examine a display case containing one of his rocking chairs. The exhibition, Hidden Hands: Contemporary American Craftspeople, featured artisans whose work represented the revival of traditional skills in the 21st century. Nathan's piece anchored a section on furniture makers who had discovered their calling outside conventional career paths. The museum placard described his journey from insurance adjuster to master craftsman, mentioning his accident and recovery, but focusing primarily on the artistic evolution that had emerged from personal crisis. Visitors paused to read the description, many running their hands along the chair's smooth curves before moving on to other displays. Nathan stood nearby, uncomfortable with the attention but proud to see his work presented alongside pieces by nationally recognized artisans. Patricia Chen had contacted me 6 months earlier about including Nathan's work in the exhibition, having followed my thesis research and subsequent publications on contemporary craft community. The museum was particularly interested in stories of midlife career transformation, recognizing that many Americans were seeking alternatives to corporate employment that offered greater personal fulfillment. My completed thesis had been accepted for publication by the University of Washington Press, with advance orders suggesting strong interest from both academic and general readers. The book examined how communities like Timber Ridge functioned as cultural preservation networks, while providing alternative economic models for people seeking meaningful work. Nathan's story provided the narrative thread that made theoretical concepts accessible to readers outside academic circles. The success of my research had led to consulting opportunities with cultural organizations across the country, work that allowed me to maintain our mountain residence while contributing to policy discussions about supporting traditional crafts in contemporary economy. The income from consulting combined with Nathan's furniture sales provided financial stability that exceeded what we'd achieved through conventional employment. Nathan's business had evolved beyond individual furniture sales to include teaching workshops and consulting with other craftspeople seeking to develop traditional skill. His workshop had expanded into a second building that accommodated students from around the region, people drawn by his reputation for patient instruction and innovative approaches to classical technique. The teaching role suited Nathan's personality perfectly, utilizing communication skills developed during his insurance career while allowing him to share knowledge that had transformed his own life. Students appreciated his systematic approach to complex techniques, and his ability to adapt traditional methods for contemporary tools and material. Harold had officially retired from active woodworking, passing his extensive tool collection and accumulated wisdom to Nathan with the understanding that tradition could only survive through transmission to younger hands. The generational transfer felt both ceremonial and practical, acknowledging Nathan's development from student to master while ensuring continuity of knowledge that connected contemporary work to centuries of accumulated expertise. Dorothy had become my unofficial research partner, helping document the stories and techniques of Timber Ridge artisans whose knowledge might otherwise disappear with their passing. Her interviews with elderly community members provided historical context for my ongoing research into how craft communities adapted to changing economic and social conditions. The collaboration between Dorothy and me had produced a comprehensive oral history archive that museums and universities were beginning to recognize as a valuable resource for understanding contemporary craft movement. Our work demonstrated how scholarly research could benefit from partnership with community members who possessed experiential knowledge that complemented academic training. My graduate degree had opened doors to museum positions that offered alternatives to traditional academic careers. Several institutions had approached me about curatorial roles that would utilize my research expertise while allowing continued residence in rural communities. The prospect of combining scholarly work with public education appealed to my interest in making cultural knowledge accessible to diverse audiences. The exhibition opening provided an opportunity to reconnect with colleagues and friends who had witnessed our transformation from suburban conventionality to rural authenticity. Many expressed amazement at how dramatically our lives had changed, some with envy for our courage to pursue uncertain dreams. Nathan's confidence had grown remarkably since the early days of his craft training, when every public sale had felt like an emotional risk. Now he discussed his techniques and design philosophy with natural authority, comfortable in his identity as a skilled artisan whose work merited serious attention. The museum recognition represented external validation of choices that had felt risky when we made them. Seeing Nathan's furniture displayed alongside work by nationally recognized craftspeople confirmed that his skills had reached professional levels despite his unconventional path to mastery. Yet the most meaningful validation came from daily satisfaction with work that engaged our authentic interests and abilities. Nathan woke each morning eager to enter his workshop, approaching each project with enthusiasm that had been absent from his insurance career. My research and writing provided intellectual challenges that utilized capabilities I'd never fully developed in library work. Our marriage had been rebuilt on foundations of honest communication and mutual support rather than the protective silence that had characterized our earlier years. We'd learned to share vulnerabilities and dreams without fear of judgment, creating space for continued growth and change. The mountain community had become more than a place of residence. It was a chosen family that provided both practical support and emotional connection. Neighbors offered assistance during difficult periods while celebrating achievements with genuine joy. The reciprocal relationships that sustained community life felt more meaningful than the superficial connections that had characterized much of our suburban social experience. Winter evenings in our mountain cabin were filled with quiet contentment as Nathan worked on designs for upcoming projects while I wrote articles or prepared for conference presentations. The isolation that had concerned some of our urban friends had become a source of peace and focus that enhanced rather than limited our professional development. Our financial situation, while less predictable than traditional employment, provided security through diversification rather than dependence on single income sources. Nathan's teaching supplemented furniture sales during slow periods, while my consulting work balanced the seasonal variations in his craft business. The flexibility of our current situation allowed us to pursue opportunities that would have been impossible with conventional career constraints. Nathan could accept large commissions that required months of concentrated work, while I could travel for research or speaking engagements without affecting our basic livelihood. The health insurance and retirement benefits that had once seemed essential now felt less crucial given our reduced living expenses and alternative income stream. The mountain lifestyle required fewer material possessions while providing greater satisfaction through meaningful work and authentic relationships. Nathan's physical recovery had progressed beyond what doctors had initially predicted, his fine motor control improving through consistent workshop practice that served as both therapy and passion. The limitations that had once seemed like barriers to his craft development had forced innovations that distinguished his work from more conventional approaches. My academic career had developed in directions I'd never imagined possible during my years of part-time library work. The combination of scholarly research and community engagement provided intellectual stimulation while maintaining connections to practical applications of cultural knowledge. The success we'd achieved felt sustainable because it was based on authentic interests rather than external expectations. Neither of us was performing roles that required suppressing essential aspects of our personalities or capabilities. Spring returned to the mountains with the dramatic beauty that renewed our appreciation for the environment we'd chosen. Cherry trees bloomed around the cabin while Nathan worked on outdoor projects and I prepared for the growing season in our expanded garden. The garden had become another collaborative project, with Nathan building raised beds and trellises while I researched heritage vegetables and traditional preservation methods. The work connected us to self-sufficiency traditions that had sustained mountain communities for generations while providing food that supplemented our reduced expenses. Visitors arrived more frequently as Nathan's reputation grew, people seeking custom furniture or instruction in traditional techniques. The stream of students and customers provided social interaction that balanced the solitude of mountain living while bringing diverse perspectives that enriched our understanding of contemporary craft movement. My research had expanded beyond the original thesis focus to examine national patterns of career transition and community formation among contemporary artisans. The work required travel to craft communities across the country, documenting similarities and differences in how traditional skills were being preserved and adapted. Each research trip reinforced our appreciation for the particular strengths of the Timber Ridge community, its balance of individual creativity and collaborative support that fostered both artistic development and economic sustainability. Nathan's teaching had evolved to include online components that reached students unable to travel to our mountain location. The digital workshops required adapting hands-on instruction for virtual delivery, a challenge that forced him to articulate techniques with greater precision while expanding his potential student base. The combination of in-person and online instruction provided income stability while maintaining the face-to-face connections that were essential to traditional craft transmission. Students who completed online coursework often traveled to Timber Ridge for intensive workshops that deepened their understanding of techniques that required hands-on guidance. My writing had attracted attention from publishers interested in books books that made academic research accessible to general audiences. The prospect of reaching readers beyond scholarly circles appealed to my interest in demonstrating how cultural knowledge could inform contemporary life choices. The book contract provided advance funding for expanded research while establishing my credentials for future projects. The publisher's enthusiasm for the manuscript suggested market demand for stories about people who had successfully navigated major life transitions. Summer brought the annual Timber Ridge Craft Fair, an event that had grown from a small community gathering to a regional attraction that drew visitors from across the Pacific Northwest. Nathan's booth displayed his latest pieces while demonstrating techniques that fascinated urban visitors unfamiliar with traditional woodworking methods. The fair provided an opportunity to connect with other craft communities whose experiences informed my ongoing research. Conversations with artisans from different regions revealed both universal patterns and local variations in how traditional skills were being maintained and transmitted. My role had evolved from observer to advocate for craft communities, using research findings to support policy discussions about funding traditional arts education and protecting artisan communities from development pressures that threatened their survival. The advocacy work felt like a natural extension of my academic research, applying scholarly findings to practical challenges that affected people whose stories had made my research possible. Nathan's commission work had expanded to include collaborations with other craftspeople, projects that combined his furniture skills with metalwork, textiles, or ceramics created by community partners. The collaborative pieces commanded higher prices while strengthening the networks that sustained the broader craft community. Fall arrived with the spectacular color displays that made mountain living feel like residing inside a work of art. Nathan's workshop hummed with activity as he prepared pieces for holiday sales while I focused on book revisions that would make my research accessible to readers seeking inspiration for their own life transition. The seasonal rhythms that governed mountain life had become natural and comfortable, providing structure that enhanced rather than constrained our work. Winter's forced indoor time was productive for detailed projects and intensive writing, while summer's social events and travel opportunities balanced periods of solitary focus. Nathan's accident, which had once seemed like a devastating interruption of our planned life, now felt like the catalyst that had enabled discoveries we never would have made through conventional career progression. The crisis had forced us to confront fundamental questions about authentic living that we might have avoided indefinitely under normal circumstances. The key that had started our transformation hung in Nathan's workshop, no longer mysterious but still meaningful as a symbol of hidden potential that remained locked until circumstances forced its discovery. Visitors often asked about its significance, providing opportunities to share the story of how crisis had led to unexpected growth and fulfillment. Our marriage had been strengthened by the honesty that crisis had demanded, replaced protective silence with authentic communication that created space for continued evolution. We'd learned that true partnership meant supporting each other's authentic development rather than maintaining comfortable but limiting routines. The suburban house that had once represented achievement now seemed like a stage set for roles we'd never fully inhabited. Our mountain cabin felt like home in ways that transcended physical comfort, providing space for the people we'd become, rather than the people we'd thought we should be. The financial security we'd pursued through conventional careers had been replaced by diversified income streams that reflected our authentic abilities and interests. The uncertainty that had initially frightened us had become manageable through community support and the confidence that came from work that engaged our deepest capability. Nathan's transformation from insurance adjuster to master craftsman demonstrated that significant life changes remained possible well beyond the age when most people assumed their identities were. His example inspired other community members to pursue suppressed creative interests, while providing hope for people considering their own career transition. My evolution from part-time librarian to published scholar and cultural advocate proved that intellectual development could accelerate rather than decline in midlife when supported by authentic passion and community encouragement. The recognition my work had received validated choices that had initially seemed impractical and risky. The success we'd achieved felt sustainable because it was based on values and interests that connected us to something larger than individual ambition. Our work contributed to preserving cultural knowledge while building communities that supported authentic living for others seeking alternatives to conventional career paths. As winter returned to the mountains, bringing the quiet focus that enhanced our most productive periods, Nathan and I reflected on how completely our lives had been transformed by the discovery of a simple brass key. What had begun as a mystery about hidden aspects of our marriage had revealed possibilities for authentic living that neither of us had imagined possible. The key that had unlocked Nathan's workshop door had opened pathways to lives that honored our deepest capabilities and interests, while building communities that sustained both individual creativity and collective wisdom. We discovered that the greatest security came not from maintaining protective facades, but from the courage to reveal and develop our authentic selves in partnership with others who shared our values. The mystery that had started everything was no longer about what Nathan had been hiding, but about what we'd both been capable of becoming when we found the courage to unlock our true potential. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.